This beggar girl saves Millionaire from deadly accident, but when they think everything is okay, something worse happens. Comment and give my story a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The desperate scream echoed through the opulent lobby of the Grand Royal Hotel like an emergency siren, slicing through the elegant murmur of conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses. Emily, a 4-year-old girl who looked barely 2 due to severe malnutrition, ran with her thin legs towards the impeccably suited man heading for the golden elevator. "Don't go in! Don't go in!" she cried, her large, dark eyes shining with an urgency that made any adult stop to watch her. Her dirty and torn clothes contrasted violently with the polished marble and crystal chandeliers that decorated the sophisticated environment. Richard Sterling, a 30-year-old businessman and owner of Sterling Construction, turned around irritated at the noise. His movie star handsome features twisted into an expression of disgust at seeing the dirty child running towards him. He had just come out of a crucial meeting with foreign investors interested in his real estate ventures, and the last thing he needed was public embarrassment caused by a beggar. "Security!" Richard shouted, stepping back a few paces to prevent the girl from touching him. "Get this child out of here immediately!" Emily continued to scream, her little hands trying to reach the sleeve of Richard's suit. There was something in her eyes that went beyond common despair, a premature wisdom that impressed and disturbed at the same time. She had spent 2 years living on the streets of Chicago, surviving on handouts and food scraps found in the trash, developing instincts that most people would never need to use. The hotel doorman quickly approached, trying to pull Emily away from the businessman. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, I don't know how she got in." "I don't care how she got in," Richard snapped, adjusting his tie with abrupt movements. "The important thing is that she gets out, now." But Emily didn't give up. With surprising strength for her diminutive size, she broke free from the doorman's hands and threw herself in front of the elevator door, stretching out her arms as if trying to physically block Richard's passage. "Danger! Big danger!" Her words came out in gasps, mixed with sobs of despair. "Can't go up, gonna fall." Richard looked at the girl with a mixture of anger and curiosity. There was something in the intensity of her gaze that made him hesitate for a moment. Even so, his irritation prevailed. "That's enough of this nonsense," he muttered, bypassing the child to press the elevator button. The doorman finally managed to restrain Emily, who continued to scream and struggle as she was dragged away from the elevator. Richard entered the golden cabin along with 3 waiting guests, an elegantly dressed elderly couple and a businessman talking on the phone. The elevator doors began to close slowly. Richard could hear Emily's muffled screams echoing through the lobby, but he chose to ignore them. He pressed the button for the 15th floor, where his executive suite was located, and leaned against the mirrored wall of the cabin. It was then that the most primitive instinct in his mind alerted him. Something was wrong, very wrong. Unable to explain why, Richard felt a wave of panic spreading through his chest. The image of Emily's desperate eyes returned to his mind with an inexplicable force. Impulsively, he pressed the emergency button and forced the doors open when the elevator was only 2 floors above the ground floor. "Excuse me," he murmured to the other passengers, quickly exiting the cabin. "I forgot something important." The other occupants looked at him strangely, but Richard was already walking quickly towards the emergency staircase. He himself couldn't understand his reaction. Why had he left the elevator? Why had the girl's words affected him so much? He was descending the stairs when the most terrifying sound he had ever heard in his life echoed throughout the building, a deafening metallic crash, followed by screams of horror and the sound of structures shattering. The elevator had plummeted 20 stories. Richard ran back to the lobby, where a crowd was already forming around the wreckage. The smell of twisted metal and smoke filled the air. Paramedics arrived running, but everyone knew there was nothing they could do for the 3 occupants who had remained in the cabin. In the midst of the chaos, Richard searched for Emily's eyes. He found her sitting in a corner of the lobby, hugging her knees, trembling violently. Her little face was wet with tears, and she was rocking back and forth, whispering incomprehensible words. An overwhelming gratitude took over Richard. That dirty, mistreated girl had saved his life. But along with the gratitude came a disturbing question that would make him question everything he thought he knew about the world. How had a 4-year-old child known that the elevator was going to fall? As ambulance sirens echoed through the city and reporters began to gather outside the hotel, Richard made a decision that would change his life forever. He slowly approached Emily, knelt down beside her and, for the first time in years, felt his heart break at seeing the suffering in a child's eyes. 3 weeks had passed since the accident at the Grand Royal Hotel, and Richard Sterling's penthouse had become a silent battlefield. Emily occupied the guest room, but her presence echoed through every room of the luxurious apartment like a disturbing ghost that no one could ignore. Isabella Ford, a 28-year-old architect and Richard's fiancée, watched the girl with a mixture of disgust and irritation that grew with each passing day. Her always impeccable blonde hair and designer clothes contrasted violently with Emily's still fragile appearance, who even after weeks of adequate feeding still looked like a broken doll. "This can't go on, Richard," Isabella said, crossing her arms as she watched Emily obsessively drawing on the living room floor with crayons. "You can't turn our house into an orphanage. What will people think?" Richard, who was reviewing contracts from his construction company at the dining table, looked up wearily. There was something different about him since the accident, a restlessness that Isabella couldn't understand. "She saved my life, Isabella. I can't just abandon her." "Coincidence," Isabella retorted coldly. "A traumatized child shouting nonsense. You're romanticizing a situation that could have been completely accidental." Emily continued to draw, seemingly oblivious to the discussion, but her small fingers moved with a strange urgency. The drawing that emerged on the paper was disturbing. A dark car crashed against a tree with human figures scattered around. Richard watched the drawing and felt a chill run down his spine. "What is this, Emily?" The girl raised her large, dark eyes, still shining with that premature wisdom that made him uncomfortable. She pointed to the drawing and then to the window, murmuring incomprehensible words that sounded like urgent warnings. "See," Isabella said, exasperated. "She can't even speak properly. She needs professional help, not our misdirected charity." That afternoon, while Richard was in his construction company office, he received a call that made his blood run cold. Gary Smith, his business partner of 5 years, had been in a serious car accident. The dark vehicle had collided against a tree on the highway connecting Chicago to its suburbs, exactly as depicted in Emily's drawing. "How is he?" Richard asked on the phone, his hands trembling slightly. "He's going to survive, but he's in serious condition," replied the doctor's voice. "Multiple fractures, head trauma. He'll be in recovery for months." Richard hung up the phone and stared blankly at his office wall. 2 coincidences in less than a month. First the elevator, now Gary's accident. Both situations had been anticipated by Emily in some inexplicable way. When he arrived home that night, he found Isabella on the phone, speaking in a low voice. She hung up quickly when she saw him enter. "Who was that?" Richard asked. "No one important," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "How's Gary?" Richard told her about the accident, carefully observing Isabella's reaction. She listened with apparent concern, but he noticed something strange in her eyes, an almost imperceptible satisfaction, as if she was confirming something she already knew. "That's terrible," she said, but her voice sounded mechanical. "Maybe it's time for you to rethink this whole situation with the girl. These coincidences aren't healthy." That night, Richard was awakened by screams coming from Emily's room. He ran there and found her sitting in bed, sweating and trembling, pointing to the window while babbling desperate words. "What is it, honey?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Emily looked at him with her huge eyes full of tears and pointed to the table where she used to draw. There was a new drawing there, men in suits arguing aggressively around a table with papers scattered, and one of them pointing accusingly at a figure that vaguely resembled Richard. "Who are these men?" Richard muttered to himself, studying the drawing. The next morning, Isabella made a call that would change everything. "Dr. Nancy Peterson, this is Isabella Ford. I need your professional services to assess a child with severe behavioral disorders." Nancy Peterson, a 35-year-old child psychologist specializing in trauma, listened to Isabella's description of Emily, a girl with selective mutism, obsessive behaviors, and possible hallucinations. "She poses a danger to herself and others," Isabella continued. "I need a report that proves the need for specialized hospitalization." Nancy asked some technical questions, but something in Isabella's urgency made her uncomfortable. "I need to evaluate the child personally before any diagnosis," she said. "And do the parents authorize this evaluation?" "My fiancé is taking care of her temporarily," Isabella explained. "He's too emotionally involved to make rational decisions. That's why I need to act." Meanwhile, in the construction company office, Richard received an unexpected visit. Clarence Miller, a 45-year-old City Hall engineer, entered his office with a folder full of documents and a grave expression on his face. "Mr. Sterling, I need to talk to you about some irregularities we found in the recently approved projects." Richard felt his stomach clench. He had inherited some questionable contracts from the former partner who had retired 2 years earlier, but he had always avoided looking too closely at the details. What kind of irregularities? Systematic overbilling, materials of lower quality than specified, approvals that circumvented safety standards, Clarence said, spreading the papers on the table. "We're talking about a serious investigation that could result in criminal charges." Richard looked at the documents with growing horror. He recognized his signature on several of them, although he didn't remember personally approving all those projects. Gary always took care of the paperwork. "Is Gary Smith also being investigated?" Richard asked. Clarence hesitated for a moment. "Actually, it was Mr. Smith who contacted us. He provided evidence suggesting that you are primarily responsible for the scheme." The words hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. Gary had anticipated him, placing all the blame on him even before the investigation officially began. Emily's drawing the night before made sense now. She had anticipated this betrayal. When he arrived home that afternoon, he found an unfamiliar woman talking to Emily in the living room. Isabella made the introductions with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Richard, this is Dr. Nancy Peterson. She came to assess Emily's psychological state." Richard looked at Emily, who was huddled on the sofa, watching the psychologist with suspicion. The girl was holding a new drawing firmly in her hands, but she kept it turned down, hiding its content. "I didn't authorize any assessment," Richard said, his voice laden with tension from the difficult day he had had. "That's exactly why we need it," Isabella retorted. "You're not thinking clearly, Richard. This child needs professional help." Nancy watched the dynamics between the adults with professional interest. There were tensions there that went far beyond the child's well-being. She decided to approach Emily directly. "Hi, Emily, can I see your drawing?" The girl hesitated, looked at Richard as if asking for permission, and then, slowly, turned the paper over. The drawing showed a blonde woman handing a child over to men in uniform, while a man in a suit watched everything sadly in the background. Isabella paled at the sight of the drawing. Nancy noticed the reaction and began to suspect that she had been hired for something very different from what she had initially imagined. Nancy Peterson left Richard's penthouse that afternoon with more questions than answers. Emily's drawing had revealed something disturbing about Isabella's true intentions, and the psychologist was beginning to question the reasons why she had been hired. During her 15 years of career, she had learned to recognize when a child was being manipulated by adults with hidden agendas. In the following days, Nancy returned for sessions with Emily, but each encounter left her more uneasy. The girl showed no signs of severe mental disorders, as Isabella had described. On the contrary, she demonstrated a sharp perception of the world around her that bordered on the extraordinary. "Emily, tell me about your drawings," Nancy said during a session, sitting on the floor next to the child. "Why do you draw these things?" Emily looked at her with those huge eyes that seemed to carry the weight of experiences far beyond her 4 years. "The bad things come before they happen," she murmured, her voice still weak but clearer than when she had arrived. "I see it in my head, then I draw." "You see it how? In dreams?" The girl shook her head. "No, when people are sad or angry, bad things stay close to them. I feel it." Nancy felt a shiver. During her 2 years living on the streets, Emily had developed a survival ability that allowed her to anticipate dangers. But there was something deeper there, something that traditional science couldn't easily explain. Meanwhile, Richard's life systematically crumbled. Clarence Miller's investigation had intensified, and new lawsuits arrived daily at his office. Gary, still recovering from the accident, had provided more damaging evidence, always shifting the blame to Richard. "How did he manage to gather so much evidence against me?" Richard asked his lawyer during a tense meeting. "It seems he's been documenting everything for years," the lawyer replied, leafing through the case files. "Emails, contracts, recordings of conversations. It's as if he's been preparing for this for a long time." Richard remembered Emily's drawings, showing men in suits conspiring. The girl had anticipated not only the betrayal, but the full extent of Gary's plan. This made him think about how many other dangerous situations might be approaching. At home, the tension between him and Isabella had reached an unsustainable point. She constantly pushed for Emily's institutionalization, citing reports from Dr. Nancy that Richard had never seen. "She confirmed that the girl needs specialized treatment," Isabella insisted. "We can no longer ignore the gravity of the situation." "I want to see these reports," Richard demanded. "Medical confidentiality," Isabella retorted quickly, "but I can assure you that the recommendation is clear." That night, Emily made a drawing that left Richard frozen. It was an image of a large house surrounded by other children, and in the center, a boy who looked exactly like her. The child in the drawing had the same large, dark eyes, the same intense expression. "Who is this boy, Emily?" Richard asked, pointing to the central figure. "My brother," she whispered, and for the first time since he had met her, Richard saw tears rolling down her face. "Tommy, he's alone." Richard felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. Emily had a brother, a family that had been separated. "Where is he?" Emily pointed to the drawing of the big house. "With other kids, place far away. He cries at night like me." The next morning, Nancy made a decision that would change everything. Instead of preparing the report that Isabella expected, she decided to investigate Emily's past on her own. There was something about the description of the house with other children that intrigued her. She drove to the outskirts of Chicago, following an intuition based on the details of Emily's drawings. She asked at health centers, rural schools, and churches about shelters for abandoned children. It was in a small village 40 miles from the city that she found the first real clue. "Bernice Miller," said an elderly woman when Nancy described what she was looking for. "She took care of abandoned children in an old house down the road, but I haven't seen her in a while." Nancy found the property at the end of a dirt road. The house was partially abandoned, but there were still signs that someone lived there. A 52-year-old woman with graying hair and a face marked by suffering answered the door. "Bernice Miller?" Nancy asked. The woman looked at her suspiciously. "Depends who's asking." Nancy showed a photo of Emily that she had discreetly taken during a session. "Do you recognize this child?" Bernice's face transformed instantly. Emily, she whispered, bringing her hands to her chest. My God, where is she? Is she okay? Can I come in? I need to know her story. Bernice led Nancy inside the simple house. There were toys scattered around and children's drawings on the walls, evidence that other children still lived there, although none were visible at the moment. Emily and Tommy arrived here 4 years ago, Bernice began, serving coffee in chipped cups. Their mother, addicted to drugs, abandoned them on a rainy night. Said she would be back but never showed up again. Tommy is the twin brother? Yes. They were inseparable. They had something special, you know. They could feel when something bad was going to happen. They saved other children here several times from accidents. Nancy felt her breathing quicken. What happened to them? Bernice's face hardened. The county started investigating my work here. They wanted to shut everything down, send the children to the official city shelter. That overcrowded place where children are just numbers. And then, I managed to hide some children, including Tommy, but Emily was taken by a couple who promised to take care of her. I lied to the social workers, said she had been legally adopted. Bernice got up and walked to the window. 2 months later, the couple abandoned her on the streets when they discovered she had these premonitions. They thought she was possessed. Nancy felt nauseous. And Tommy? Where is he now? In the official shelter. I managed to hide him for a while, but eventually they found him. I visit when I can, but... Bernice choked back tears. He's wasting away there. Without his sister, without an environment that understands his gifts, he's closing himself off more and more. That afternoon, Nancy drove to the official Chicago shelter. The place was exactly as Bernice had described. Overcrowded, with children of all ages crammed into inadequate dormitories. She found Tommy in the yard, sitting alone under a tree, drawing in the dirt with a stick. The boy was identical to Emily. The same large, dark eyes, the same expression too old for his age. When Nancy approached, he looked up and studied her for a long moment. You know my sister, he said, and it wasn't a question. How do you know? Tommy pointed to his drawing in the dirt. It was an image of a woman talking to a little girl, exactly as Nancy had done during her sessions with Emily. Is she safe? The boy asked, his voice filled with heartbreaking worry. She is, Nancy replied, and I'm going to do everything I can to reunite you two. Meanwhile, in Richard's penthouse, Isabella made a call that would seal the fate of everyone involved. Clarence, this is Isabella. I have the information I promised about Richard's business dealings, she said, looking to make sure she was alone. He keeps compromising documents in the office safe. The combination is his birthday. On the other end of the line, Clarence Miller smiled with satisfaction. Great. With this evidence, I can expedite the process. He'll be arrested within a week. Isabella hung up and looked out the window, where she could see Richard playing in the penthouse garden with Emily. The girl had managed to elicit genuine laughter from him, something she herself hadn't been able to do for months. Soon everything will return to normal, she murmured to herself, unaware that Emily, down below, had stopped playing and was looking directly at the window where she was, with an expression that mixed sadness and something that looked a lot like pity. The most shocking discovery of Richard's life came through a yellowed envelope that Bernice held with trembling hands when Nancy brought her to his penthouse on a foggy March morning. Emily had drawn again during the early hours, this time an image of 3 children playing together, and one of them had features that vaguely resembled Richard himself as a child. I need to tell you a truth I've kept for 28 years, Bernice said, her tired eyes fixed on Richard. About your true origins. Richard felt the world spinning around him as Bernice opened the envelope and revealed documents that changed everything he thought he knew about himself. Forged certificates, irregular adoption records, and a faded photo of a young shelter worker holding a baby in her arms. Your birth mother's name was Emerald Sterling. She worked at my shelter for 3 years before leaving pregnant, Bernice explained. She gave you to a wealthy family who couldn't have children, using the adoption money to try to rebuild her life away from poverty. Richard looked at the photo with trembling hands. The young woman had the same dark, intense eyes as Emily and Tommy, the same expression that seemed to see beyond the present. "This means that," he began, but the words trailed off. "You have the same special sensitivity," Bernice confirmed. "You developed a sharp intuition for business. You could feel when investments in the stock market were going to go wrong, or when someone was lying in meetings. But you grew up in a privileged environment that channeled those gifts differently." Emily, who had remained silent until then, approached Richard and gently touched his hand. "Family," she whispered, and for the first time since he had met her, Richard saw a genuine smile light up her small face. Nancy watched the scene with tears in her eyes. Everything made sense now. The instant connection between Richard and Emily, the way he had been able to feel the danger in the elevator, his natural ability to identify business opportunities that had transformed him into a successful entrepreneur before he turned 30. My fortune, my assets, all of that came from this sensitivity I inherited from her, Richard murmured, looking again at the photo of Emerald. But the meeting was interrupted by the sound of approaching sirens. Isabella had made good on her threat and provided enough information for Clarence to obtain an arrest warrant against Richard. Police officers raided the penthouse, confiscating documents and arresting a man who finally understood that he had spent his entire life running from his true origins. "You knew about this," Isabella accused when she saw Bernice in the room. "You knew he was just another orphan like this girl. That's why you want to see me in jail," Richard realized as he was handcuffed. "You can't accept that your fiancé came from the same poverty as Emily." Isabella didn't answer, but her silence was eloquent. Years of building an image of a perfect relationship with a successful businessman crumbled before the truth about his humble origins. Nancy acted quickly. With Richard detained and Isabella trying to forcibly institutionalize Emily, she used her professional contacts to obtain a temporary restraining order preventing the separation of the children. She argued that Emily and Tommy exhibited severe anxiety disorders caused by the separation, and that any new family disruption could cause irreversible psychological damage. While Richard faced interrogations and tried to prove his innocence in the corruption scheme, Bernice took Emily to the official shelter for the reunion with Tommy. The moment the twins saw each other after 4 years of separation was both devastating and healing. They ran to each other and hugged as if they would never let go. Emily whispered in her brother's ear, telling him about Richard, about the drawings she made alone, about the loneliness she carried. Tommy responded with his own confessions, how he had tried to protect other children in the shelter using his premonitions, how he dreamed every night about his sister. "Now there are 3 of us," Emily said, showing Tommy a drawing she had made of the family she had discovered she had. "Richard is like us." 2 weeks later, the truth about the corruption scheme finally came to light. Gary, pressured by federal investigators who discovered inconsistencies in his testimony, confessed that he had orchestrated everything himself, using Richard's signature on documents he had never fully read. The partner had planned the betrayal for years, accumulating false evidence for the right moment to take total control of the company. Richard was released, but his construction company had gone bankrupt during the scandal. Investors withdrew their capital, contracts were cancelled, and his reputation in the real estate industry was destroyed. The man who had once amassed enough wealth to hold bitcoins and investments in international funds now faced the prospect of starting over from scratch. "I lost everything," he told Nancy when they met at the hospital where Tommy was being examined after years of neglect at the official shelter. "You didn't lose everything," she replied, pointing to where Emily and Tommy were drawing together on the floor of the hallway. "You gained a real family." Isabella had disappeared from his life the moment she discovered his origins. taking with her the engagement ring and leaving only a cold letter explaining that she couldn't associate with someone with that kind of past. 6 months later, Richard used his last savings to buy a small rural property an hour from Chicago. The simple house had a large yard where Emily and Tommy could run freely, and workshops where Richard discovered he had a natural talent for handcrafted carpentry. Bernice moved there too, bringing with her 3 other children that the official shelter couldn't adequately care for. Nancy visited regularly, fascinated by observing how the loving and stable environment allowed the children's special abilities to develop healthily. "They use their gifts to help," she explained in a report she wrote about the case. "Emily warns when someone in the community is going to get hurt. Tommy senses when people have bad intentions. And Richard, he's discovered that he can feel when the wood is going to crack before he even starts working with it." A year later, the small, unconventional family had taken root in the rural community. Richard sold his handcrafted furniture at local fairs, using techniques that seemed to come naturally, as if his hands knew exactly how to work the wood. His assets were now measured in smiles of happy children and the satisfaction of neighbors who bought his creations. Emily and Tommy, now 5 years old and finally looking healthy, attended the rural school where they were known as the children who always knew when someone was sad or needed help. Their premonitions had transformed into a subtle way of caring for others, protecting classmates from minor accidents and alerting teachers to family problems of other children. "You know what I've discovered," Richard said one night when the 3 were sitting on the porch watching the stars. "My true wealth was never in the investments in euros or dollars that I made. It was here, waiting to be found." Emily nestled into his lap, firmly holding Tommy's hand. "Now we're a real family," she whispered. "Forever," confirmed Tommy, his voice stronger than it had ever been. And as the wind gently swayed the trees around the simple house, Richard understood that he had traded a life of apparent financial success for something much more valuable, the chance to offer love and protection to children who, like himself one day, needed only an opportunity to flourish in an environment where their differences were celebrated instead of feared. The fortune that really mattered was there, measured not in assets or profitability, but in the ability to transform pain into hope and loneliness into belonging. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment and give it a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.